Hello YouTube. Today is April 19th, 2019. Kevin here for Superpower Broadcasting. Today I'm going to be discussing very funny development. And Coulter has stated now that she would consider voting for Bernie Sanders if Bernie Sanders were to simply and only withdraw his immigration standpoint back to what his original statements were in 2005 as opposed to Donald Trump. And this is really funny for a number of reasons that I'm going to get into here. It's such a great story because it exposes fully the lack of principle, the lack of overall political, I guess the best word to describe would be worldview. It reveals Coulter to really be truly this one issue joke, this one issue clown show, this one trick pony, where she's on the same level now as some of the evangelical anti-choice voters, where they will cast their ballots solely on whoever the leader of their mega church with 50,000 people says to go and vote for after giving them $20 out of their money each week or whatever so that they can get a new private jet. It's that level of insanity where Coulter, who's this deeply conservative woman and has written quite a few books, and she brags about the books quite often to up her prestige, that are all very provocatively conservative, that are all very overtly social conservative in nature, and at the same time having this sort of pretense of being this somehow down-to-earth person who understands what's going on. I've seen Vice videos of her hanging out with comedians and things, trying to make herself look cool. But at the end of the day, she's a lot like Donald Trump in that sense, in that she ultimately wants attention. She loves the fame, but she criticizes Hollywood. She criticizes a lot of the generally more socially liberal culture that people that are generally usually famous tend to align with. The same thing has happened with Trump, where he's used the number of musicians work before at campaign rallies, and they've called him out on it and said, hey, look, dude, we disagree on everything. Stop doing that. That's my intellectual property. And so basically the conservatives in particular, they have this fascination with fame, this fascination with the cult of personality. And so the second that they get a single actor on their side, like Ted Nugent or Ronald Reagan, they're immediately held up as all this mantle of, oh, we have somebody popular on our side too. Now, Ronald Reagan earned a lot of his support and everything, but at the same time, that it's definitely the case that the Republicans have a definite shortfall in terms of celebrity figures. And so they have Donald Trump, and they have Ann Coulter, who's a wannabe celebrity, and they got Ted Nugent, and that's about it right now, basically, since the whole turnover to the party of Putin, as Bill Maher describes. What's interesting about the case of Ann Coulter, of course, is that she's now so disillusioned with Trump being feckless and ineffectual and ultimately incompetent on trying to get the border wall funding that she's willing to actually back Sanders. And she stated that she doesn't care about the socialism. She just wants the borders enforced or whatnot. She wants a strong border policy. And the first thing that crosses my mind, of course, right, because I've studied North Korea for years. Even before I went to university, North Korea was always an interest of mine. I've studied the political history, a lot of the social history, some of the cinema, a lot of aspects of North Korean society. And guess what? They're her dreamland, basically. Because what do? They have the strongest border policy in the world. They're 100% homogenous if you take the Swedish diplomats and the Swiss diplomats in the capital out of the equation, they're 100% homogenous Korean society with a racially pure ideology that's on the same level of insanity and pseudoscience as the Nazis had with the myth of the Aryan people, where you are basically held up as the cleanest race, so to speak. The Korean people are the cleanest race, and the Japanese are dirty, the whites are dirty, the Africans are dirty, everybody else is dirty, the Chinese are dirty, but the Koreans are this pure, clean, genetically immaculate manifestation of divine will, in essence. That's part of the North Korean ideology, and you can see it in their propaganda works, where even though they have this very socialist, this very internationally Marxist worker solidarity aesthetic to them, they always depict the black people in the shadows. They depict the fellow travelers from the U.S. and the West as sketchy, but they always depict the Koreans as pure and angelic and everything, because it's ultimately a very racialized and very racially chauvinistic ideology with Juche in North Korea. But Juche is exactly at this point what Ann Coulter seems to want, because she says that she's fine with the socialism as long as she gets a strong border policy. Well, North Korea is one of the most socialist countries in history. In fact, as far as an experiment has gone in socialist economics, they're about as close to a proper run of that course that you could get, where they are, to some extent, the most autarkic economy of the last 150 years or so. They're called the Hermit Kingdom for a reason, right? Where they nominally will refuse to trade with anybody. Part of it, of course, is due to sanctions, but it's a pride of their ideology that they produce everything on their own. And of course, this is a myth, because they're a largely mountainous country with a very low percentage of arable land relative to their population. I believe their arable land is somewhere around 22 to 24%, and yet they have 25 million people in a very small country. And this is part of the reason that when the Soviets stopped bankrolling them in the Cold War as an ally against China, they had this massive famine, because the myth of North Korea as being economically self-reliant was aestheticized and glorified and made part and parcel of the ideology. Even before 1991, there was this pretense of Juche economics. But nowadays, for the most part, apart from some coal exports, they have about $8 billion or so in exports, almost all of which goes to China. But with some of the sanctions enforcement, that's gone down to some extent. The only real exceptions to the autarkic model of the North Korean system is the great leader and his swag yachts and his Mercedes-Benz, and he gets his yachts from Europe, the Benz from Europe, the Swiss cheese from Europe, the cognac, etc. He's of course the exception to the autarkic model, and his father was the exception, and his grandfather was the exception still, where they talk a lot. Well, Kim Jong-il didn't really talk that much. He gave one speech that was essentially one sentence long, because he didn't have to. He didn't have to give interviews. He didn't have to do anything. He could stay in bed for 20 years if he wanted, and the system would still uphold him as the dear leader. But with Kim Jong-un rather, and Kim Il-sung, they talk about the idea of North Korean Juche-ness, the idea of self-reliance, and yet they all own, in Kim Jong-un's case, over 100 Mercedes-Benz. Kim Il-sung had a Mercedes-Benz fetish, where all the party officials would drive S-classes around. If you look at pictures of Pyongyang from the 1980s, 1970s, all the Communist Party, all the Workers' Party, it's just, you see 100, 200 S-Class Mercedes, different models. They're the only ones that are allowed to travel above the 50-kilometer-an-hour limit. They're the only country, really, that has speed limits that differ according to social class rather than according to the conditions of the road. So if you're a common pleb in essence, or a military vehicle or something, you can only go 40. Even though in that case, you're still in the upper echelon of the country, because almost all the country doesn't have access to vehicles. In fact, you're more likely to know somebody who owns a private jet in Canada or the US than you are to know somebody who owns a car in North Korea. But what's interesting about this whole situation, of course, is that this is a socialist system. It's a planned economic system. It's the epitome of every stereotype of what the conservative and the Republican media arm, particularly on Fox News, has ultimately levied and demonized Bernie Sanders as being. And I've made a video about this. I've talked about this in the past, that Bernie Sanders himself isn't actually a socialist, even though he uses the term. I think it's a dumb move. I think it's a foolish move to brand himself as that, because he's a social democrat. But Coulter and others have maligned him as actually being a socialist. And in fairness to them, he calls himself a socialist. So in my view, it's fair game, even though I think it's disingenuous on a lot of their part, because a lot of the top people at Fox News, a lot of the conservative intellectuals, if you can call them that, such as Ben Shapiro and Coulter, they know better. They know the terms. They've been to university. They understand the difference between socialism and social democracy. But he lends credence to their demonization of him because he calls himself a socialist, even though he's not. So that's Bernie's fault wholly. He fully deserves to be called that, but it is still ultimately somewhat disingenuous to call him a socialist, because he's not actually advocating for a full 100% government management of the economy. He still would have private property. He would still have private ownership of vehicles. He'd still have private corporations. You could still start an LLC under Bernie Sanders if he became president, whereas under socialism, every industry would be managed and run by the government. Everything would be a bureau of the government. You wouldn't have Facebook. It would be a bureau of the government. It would be, I guess, the Bureau of Social Media or something. Or, if you want to get Orwellian about it, like the Ministry of Truth or something, Ministry of Information, you'd have more of a model of what you would actually see in North Korea. So in Coulter's case, I don't know as much about her in terms of how educated she is. I know that she has a law degree, but I don't know how politically educated she is. I know with Ben Shapiro in particular, he's a pretty smart guy. He knows a lot of these nuances, but he's good at debating, and he's good at ultimately demonizing people in a way where it puts them in a position where they're kind of cornered. Now, of course, Bernie Sanders cornered himself on this, but I don't know for certain that Ann Coulter knows the distinction between social democracy and socialism. But if it is truly the case that when she thinks of socialism and she thinks of Bernie Sanders and socialism together, and she imagines a system like Venezuela or North Korea, well, in that case, for her to make this quote recently, to make this statement that she would consider voting for him and accept all the socialism just as long as she gets her strong border policy, well, she's either being disingenuous by calling his stuff socialism, which she, in fairness, would have the ability to do because he brands himself in that regard, or she's actually kind of clueless on the issue and thinks of Sanders as espousing for actual socialism, and she would actually rather live in a system like North Korea as long as it enables a racial purity type of immigration system, in which case all the idea of the Republicans as the party of freedom, the party of liberty, the party of the Founding Fathers, the party of the Revolution, the party of Lincoln, the party of all of the sorts of notions of free enterprise, to see this and to not condemn Ann Coulter, to still uphold Ann Coulter as this sort of ultimate public intellectual, if you will, because the standards are so low on the Republican side these days. It's kind of disgusting, actually, because she's outright admitting her moral degeneracy, she's admitting her duplicity, she's admitting her hypocrisy right there, where this whole pretense of, well, we want small government, we want free enterprise. We want people to be able to live according to liberty. We don't want the government telling us what to do. No, it turns out that's all just a ploy so that she can get her racially chauvinistic immigration policy through. That's basically it, and she's admitting it now. She's admitting that, yeah, she'll take socialism as long as she gets a wall. Well, North Korea has a wall. If you try to defect to North Korea, hardly anybody's actually successfully managed to do it because they're so well guarded. But one example is an American in the 1950s, Joe Dresnock, and the BBC did a great documentary about him. It's called Crossing the Line. I believe it's from 2008. And he defected there to flee court-martial after getting in trouble with the U.S. Army for all kinds of insubordination, prostitution, all kinds of stuff. So he defected to North Korea. He was one of, I believe, 6 Americans that successfully managed to do it. But in the time since he did that in the 50s, the North Koreans have actually built a wall to stop people defecting into the country, basically. And it's interesting because on the one hand, it plays into the propaganda, in essence, on the North Korean side, if you build a wall to some degree, because it makes people, even though I would argue that these days, after the Great Famine and everything, that it's probably apparent that it is all just a sham. But if you build a wall, you could argue that it's to keep people out, and some people might buy it, especially if it's back in Kim Il-sung's day, where he did actually have some genuine support among the population after the war and after the Reconstruction and everything. It's possible to use it as a propaganda ploy to say, we don't want the world flooding us with their filth, and that's what the North Koreans have branded it as. And of course, in reality, it's to stop the North Korean people from escaping, but there's no way to distinguish, in terms of the physics of it, and in terms of the actual object, whether the wall's really there to keep people out or to keep people in. Because in the United States right now, up until very recently, there was a long trend where actually more people in the net were actually leaving to Mexico than coming into the United States. The U.S. was actually losing some population to Mexico. So people that were crossing illegally, people that were already there, were deciding that they were actually going to go back to Mexico, or they were going to go to Mexico because perhaps there were more economic opportunities, or perhaps they realized that the United States was not maybe the best place that they had envisioned it to be for economic opportunities. There are many reasons, or it's also possible that a lot of people kind of predicted that the whole Trump thing was going to happen and left. But there's generally been more of a downturn up until fairly recently with the net inflow versus outflow of immigration to the United States, and illegal immigration, I should say. And so to some extent, if you built a wall, it could be counterproductive because it would stop a lot of undocumented migrants from going back to Mexico if they want to get out of the United States. So it could, though I'm not arguing in any sense here that the U.S. is like North Korea, but it could accidentally function to some extent to keep some people in. Of course, realistically speaking, it would also keep some people out because there are always people trying to get into the United States in an undocumented manner. It would function in both respects, whereas in North Korea, it's almost exclusively, since the 1950s, been to keep the people in. But North Korea altogether doesn't have so much of a wall in the physical sense, as they do have about somewhere between 600,000 and 900,000 troops and guards on the demilitarized zone and the perimeter area around it, which is about altogether, it's the majority of the Korean People's Army and the active forces is stationed in fairly close proximity to the border. They, of course, have a lot of troops on the Chinese border, too, to stop defections and everything from occurring. But this is a very, very, very regimented, very closed society, the epitome of socialist economics in practice. There is no free enterprise in North Korea. There are some experiments in corporatism. There was an Egyptian telecom company that put some glass on the Reunion Hotel a few years ago to make it look somewhat nice, to make it kind of look cool, because they had spent somewhere on the order of $2 or $3 billion building the world's tallest unoccupied building back in the 80s and never finished it because they had tried to build the biggest hotel in the world and it didn't work out. They thought that they were going to get to share the Olympics. I believe it was the 1988 Olympics, if I recall correctly. Anyway, that didn't work out. But there's still this massive monument to this dismal failure. Kim Il-sung rather, had envisioned it as being a 3,000 room hotel that would be the largest hotel in the world and make North Korea the center of tourism and whatnot. And of course, it's such a dismal failure. But that's a great metaphor for socialist economics right now, where the government says we demand this, and then they force everybody to supply it. There's no natural equilibrium. It's entirely discombobulated and out of sync with what the actual economy would need, what the actual economy would gravitate towards if it were free. This is, if you believe that Coulter doesn't really know the distinction well between social democracy and socialism, this would mean that Coulter's just revealed herself and given us another data point of these libertarians or paleo-conservatives, or in Coulter's case, these provocateur conservative types that make all of these pretenses and preach about free speech, and they have all these cute talking points about free speech, and they have all these talking points against the people on Berkeley. But then she says, well, yeah, give me socialism, but also give me a wall. And I would say, well, Coulter, there are plenty of examples of history. I've just been talking about North Korea here because it's a country that's still around, and she could go live there right now if she wanted to. She probably wouldn't be able to get through the filter. She'd probably be apprehended by the Korean People's Army the moment she tried, and they'd probably do to her what they did to Warmbier. They'd probably accuse her of being a spy or conducting espionage or something, but she could, in theory, at least apply for asylum in North Korea. It's almost impossible that they would grant it to her. It would be ridiculous if they did. They would probably suspect her as being a spy. But, and in fairness to the regime, they'd probably be right to do so because it sounds so ridiculous. It's such a stupid occurrence to actually have happen. But Coulter, whether she realizes it or not, she's making an argument that she should actually go and live in North Korea if she wants to live in a socialist system with a wall. Now, I get that she says, well, she doesn't necessarily want the socialism. She'll just put up with it so that she can get the wall. Well, if it's such a big deal, and if she's willing to disown Trump, who's one of the most draconian politicians in modern U.S. history on the issue of immigration, if she's willing to disown him and say that he's too soft on immigration, well, there aren't that many examples of more strict, more draconian immigration models that you can look to outside of the socialist world. But I got news, Coulter. If you ever happen to be watching this, there are plenty of socialist countries in history that had a great immigration system by your standpoint. East Germany, for example, the Soviet Union, they built quite a few walls. The Berlin Wall was a primary example of this, where they had a socialist economy, and they built a wall not only to keep out spies, not only to keep out fifth columns, but in reality to keep people inside to basically plug the brain drain. And Coulter, well, she has all these vague and to some extent less overt dog whistling, virtue signaling to the white identity, particularly the white male identity. She has all of this racialist, chauvinist aesthetics. She has many other lines of argument that ultimately play into some could argue a white nationalist way of thinking. Others have argued a white supremacist way of thinking. In her case, I mean, it's tough because every new statement that she gives lends more credence to the idea that she actually is a white supremacist. I used to buy into the idea that she was probably along the lines of someone like Jared Taylor, more of a white nationalist, where she herself might not necessarily want to wipe out all the other races in the world or whatever, but she doesn't want any of them in America. She sees America as a white country. That's essentially white nationalism, whereas white supremacy is more like the Hitler model, where you go and try to kill everybody who's a different skin color or suspected of being quote-unquote genetically impure. But in Ann Coulter's case, she definitely at the minimum gives the appearance of being a white supremacist. Well, and she wants that racially chauvinistic model because the whole thing about being white is goofy. One, there's no superior race. But two, if there is a superior race, if there happens to be one, well, could be the Koreans. How do we know? I mean, South Korea has had a way more rapid growth in economic productivity over the last 40 years than America has actually experienced. Even the Reconstruction era, even post-World War II, didn't have as high a GDP growth as the miracle in Seoul, basically, and the rest of South Korea. What's interesting about this, of course, is that, well, and Coulter can't go there because they're not white, they're Koreans or whatever. But I'm kind of just trying to expose the ludicrousness of this way of thinking in her case, because if she was born in Korea, she'd be making the same arguments but about the Koreans. Or if she was born in Tokyo, she'd be making the same arguments but about the Japanese. Or if she was born in Uttar Pradesh, she'd be making the same arguments about how you have to protect the Hindus, the Indians, we need to build a wall with Pakistan, all that sort of stuff. If she was born in Rwanda, for example, well, with her mindset, the way that she thinks, well, given the right time, she would have been full into the genocide. She would have been one of the people going around with machetes. I mean, just because she happens to be born in America and just because she happens to dress professionally or whatever by Western standards doesn't mean that she's not a very, very, very primitive, very tribalistic, very basal, very ultimately pernicious and ultimately damaging and historically, I would argue, ultimately very, very sort of insidious type of person where, yeah, she uses words and says some racist stuff basically these days against people of a different skin color. But if she was born in any other context where there weren't as many bars holding her back, she totally would have been in the SS or tried to get in the SS. I mean, if she happened to be born, say, 80 years or 90 years earlier and in Germany or whatever, I mean, if she was born in Russia, for example, in the 1920s, she would have been going around doing the whole, the great Russian people line that Stalin had. Basically, her whole thing is that, yeah, so she's a white supremacist, but realistically speaking, that's just because she was born in the U.S. No, she's garbage anywhere because if she would happen to be born Indian, she'd be making the Indian supremacist arguments. Like, that whole way of thinking is just a very fascist way of looking at the world. And of course, there isn't that much of a difference between socialism and fascism. One of the great examples of this, of course, is you can see at the most extreme manifestations of socialism and fascism being the Germany's National Socialism, and compare it to the Soviet Union's socialism in one country. They're almost identical. The only difference is that the racial chauvinism in the former is about the Aryan race, and the racial chauvinism in the latter is about the great Russian people, even though Stalin happened to be Georgian, but he still played at that. And so there's this whole sort of idea that Coulter has going on that's very alt-right, it's very basically fascist in the way that she conceives of things. But at the same time, it's very, very duplicitous, and it's very morally degenerate on her part, because she's making all these arguments about free speech. She has all these lines about liberty, free enterprise, but at the end of the day, she just revealed that it's all just a way to get her staunchly fascist immigration policy through. That's basically it. Because the way that she thinks of things is that the only immigrants that should be coming in the U.S. are white, and everybody else should get out. That's basically it. She wants these socialist economics. She wants protectionism. She wants the tariffs. She has basically adopted in many ways the party line of Donald Trump. But she thinks that Donald Trump hasn't gone far enough in the socialist direction. She thinks that he hasn't gone far enough in terms of building walls and shutting the U.S. off from the world. And so Ann Coulter is disgusting. And the great thing, though, about Ann Coulter is that she's so basal, and she's so much, I guess, of a provocateur. She's so hungry for attention that she will, from time to time, actually reveal her moral duplicity. Some savvy people in her camp would not make that kind of argument. They would say, oh yeah, we'll vote for the Republicans because we're principled, or we want a more conservative Republican. They wouldn't say, oh yeah, we'll vote for the socialists and we'll take socialism, but give us that wall. Because that's basically saying, I want to live in North Korea, because North Korea has the socialism and they have the wall. They've got everything. Again, North Korea is a perfect world for Ann Coulter. I wish that she would get a one-way ticket. I guess you can't fly direct to Pyongyang, but she could go to Beijing and then Shenyang and then get on one of those tours to North Korea and then defect, see how it works out. They probably give her 15 to 20 years of hard labor. But, I mean, hey, if we actually adopted and went with her society the way that she envisions it, with the brown shirts and everything else, but I guess for Trump, or maybe now for Bernie Sanders or something, the U.S. would slowly start to look like North Korea. I mean, let's just keep it real. She happens to be born in the liberal West, but her policy, everything that she's ultimately advocating for, is way outside the Overton window. She has to put this edifice on it as somehow being consistent with the Republican Party, but at the end of the day, she's so far outside of what's reasonable. She basically wants North Korea, but here, I guess like a white version of North Korea. Don't trade with anybody, don't, close off the borders, be protectionist. Yeah, so I'd say, it's a good thing that Ann Coulter ultimately reveals herself to be, well, I'm going to use the technical term here, but some people could argue and could levy this in the literal or the term that actually comes up with the connotations. But she's a national socialist. She wants a nationalist economic platform based around a socialist economic model of racial chauvinism, give all the jobs to the uneducated white males, make work, do the labor theory of value, where we have them dig a hole in the ground and then have them fill it back up so that uneducated white males can be able to not have to worry about trying to be competitive anymore, or trying to be competitive in a global economy. She's got the whole heritages thing going on. She's got the racial chauvinism. She's got all the dog whistling against anybody who doesn't match the skin color of what she perceives to be the hegemonic racial identity of the country, in America's case, white. And I'm sure if she could have it her way, she would want America to be 100% homogeneous white country with closed borders and a socialist planned economy with a very centralized authority that cracks down and suppresses any speech that she doesn't like. I mean, she might argue the opposite, though I don't even know anymore, because she's dropped a lot of these pretenses that she used to have, where we see today. She's like, I'll take socialism, but give me the big wall or whatever. And I'm like, well, Ann Coulter, I got news for you. That's not usually a bug with socialism. That's usually a feature. So if you're going to go with a socialist system, you're going to get the wall. And if you go with the wall, your country's going to look more and more socialist, because these things are inherently antithetical to the idea of free trade. They're inherently antithetical to the idea of free capital mobility, the idea of competitive markets, the idea that, well, just because somebody who's really smart was born, say, in Mexico or the Philippines, does that mean that they don't have the opportunity of being a competitive player in America? I mean, is that's weak. That's basically admitting that you can't compete with the rest of the world. That's basically saying, I need a safe space. I'm going to virtue signal to my uneducated white male fanboys. And I'm going to virtue signal about my heritages. And I'm going to want a safe space for the whole country. I want a socialist safe space with a fascist wall. That's basically what Coulter wants. And so this idea that people in her strain of conservatism care about free speech, or they care about free enterprise, or they care about liberty. Nah, it's all just a pretense so that they can build their walls and so that they can set up their Stasi-type police state. That's basically it. The paleo-conservatives are another strand of this, a lot of the libertarians too, where there are tells that will reveal their ultimate moral duplicity. Usually the best way of identifying the hypocrisy on their side about this and getting them to admit that it's all game is foreign policy, where a lot of the libertarian types, like the Ron Paul fanboys, the Rand Paul fanboys, the Molyneux fanboys, they'll usually make the argument that they're radically anti-big government in America. And then they'll be radically pro-Bashar Assad, or radically pro-Vladimir Putin, or defend Kim, or defend Saddam. They'll do the whole Saddam good, Bush bad narrative. They'll do the whole Russia good, USA bad narrative, where you can get a lot of libertarians. Now, there are some consistent libertarians that are against dictatorships anywhere in the world, but plenty of them are totally fine with fascism, and plenty of them watch Russia Today and are totally into the idea of Arab socialism and all this idea that Bashar Assad embraces, where it's all just ultimately a joke. They ultimately use these things. They virtue signal to the idea of free speech. But at the end of the day, once they get power, the first thing they're going to do is ban any expression that is from the left, right? And of course, now they'll see it as, well, we're embracing this very far sort of right way of looking at the world, and if they happen to be super right-wing, they'll see it as, well, they're doing the most that they can to crack down on their opponents and people that have a left-wing ideology. But, I mean, again, far left, far right, basically indistinguishable from one another. If you go to the far right to shut down the far left, well, all of a sudden you look a lot like the far left. And so this is the case of Coulter right now, where she's admitting that, yeah, she wants a far left economic system as long as it has a far left immigration system. In other words, build that wall, just like the North Koreans, just like the Chinese did, just like, I'm talking the communist Chinese here, just like the Soviets did, just like the Albanians did. Enver Hoxha of Albania, after he had the split with the Soviets and aligned with the communist Chinese, he built about 800,000 concrete bunkers. This in a country of a little more than 1 million or 1.5 million people back in, I believe it was the 1960s, because he predicted that there was going to be a war with the Yugoslavians and the Soviets, and so he was going to defend Albania, and he saw the Albanians as a true manifestation of communism, and the Yugoslavians and the Soviets as revisionists and not real communists. And he built the wall. Actually, walls are a very, very left-wing way of going about. Now, of course, the far right also builds walls, but that's kind of my point, is that, well, she's willing to concede to the far left on the economics. Well, she's basically willing to concede to them on everything else. She's basically willing to have the Soviet Union, but she wants the Berlin Wall. And I'm like, well, Anne, guess what? I got good news for you. You don't even have to ask for the wall. Socialist systems build walls naturally. That's just part of how the whole system works. Because if you're going to go with a essentially planned economic system, if you're going to go with a system in which you have such a mismanaged economic arrangement, where you have ultimately a racially chauvinistic way of looking at the world, if you have all these inefficiencies and you close yourself off to the world trade-wise, Well, if you didn't build a wall, everybody would leave. That's what happened in Berlin. Everybody just packed up and said, well, I'm done with this. It sucks I have to give up my home, but I'm not living under communism. Well, they're like, oh, we got a solution. We're going to build a wall. All the left-wing dictatorships build walls. It's just part and parcel of leftism, is that you build the walls so that you can ultimately stem and put a stop to the brain drain, because it's just not a competitive economic system. And in Coulter's case, sure, we could say that she's a one-issue voter, that she only cares about the immigration issue. I would argue it's more nuanced than that. I would argue that the reason why she goes to this extent, it's partly to be provocative and to get attention, but it's also partly because I've been following her casually. A lot of the stuff that she says actually really aligns quite well with the National Socialist agenda and program, where the whole idea of the Tucker Carlson model, for example, where you do make work projects for uneducated white males, my identity group, basically, my heritages. You do that, and you ban automation, you ban advancements in driverless trucking, is the example of Tucker Carlson, for example, and you do it on purpose, and you lie about it if you have to, and claim that it's dangerous, just so that you can artificially keep jobs in your country, which is goofy, because those jobs, like, people would have jobs, they'd just be in a different sector, arguably making a lot more money down the road. I've got a video coming out pretty soon where I break down the Tucker Carlson versus Ben Shapiro debate on economics, and one of the arguments that I make about this is that, well, imagine if the British did that before World War I, where they said, you know what, we are going to not go and make steel ships. We're going to keep making wooden ships because we don't want people to lose jobs or whatever. We want to keep things as the way they are. Well, they would have lost World War I so fast because the Germans would have been competitive and they would have seized on that opportunity. And even if the British tripled their navy size, if it's all ships of the line from 200 years earlier, that style, they would have been blown out of the water. All that the Germans would have needed were a couple dreadnoughts and they could sink the British Navy. Well, that's the equivalent in the United States. If the United States goes the Tucker Carlson or the Coulter route, where you say, yeah, we're going to stem innovation, we're going to stop automation, we're going to make work projects and go the FDR route and have all the white males dig a hole and then fill it back in. Or that's just a metaphor, of course, for doing any work that isn't actually demanded in the economy naturally. Well, eventually even the North Koreans will catch up to you. In 200 years, you might lose a war to North Korea because you stagnated so hard. And so this is what Ann Coulter, this is her program. This is what her buddy Tucker Carlson, this is what they want. They ultimately embrace a Brezhnev-style stagnant model of the economy that's very consistent with socialism. Really, the only thing that isn't that socialist about what they're arguing for are the aesthetics. I guess they like the old school German font a lot more than the constructivist Soviet font. But apart from fonts and apart from sickles and stars versus, the eagle or whatever symbols you want for fascism, apart from some of those aesthetic differences, it's basically the same model. It's centralized economics. It's an illiberal, authoritarian regime. Ann Coulter, I believe, has also said in the past that, you should become the God Emperor or whatever, referring to Donald Trump, though I don't know if she would embrace that too much anymore because I guess she realized that Trump is really incompetent with this. And it's funny, too, because that's one of the only things that she's right on, is that Trump's actually incompetent on the border wall funding, because the Democrats had previously offered him about $20 billion for the funding, and he turned it down. And he actually went and shut down the government, and it got to a point where they wound up offering him a fraction of that. It was somewhere on the order of about $1.5 billion. And Donnie Yesler Vladimir Trump was like, oh, I bungled this. Because the whole idea that he has the art of the deal. One, it was ghost written, and the guy who wrote it for him said, oh yeah, Trump doesn't know anything about business. Hence the 6 bankruptcies. But on top of all of that, he could arguably write The Art of the Lack of the Deal. I mean, he's basically the opposite of a good deal maker. There are so many people out there that don't have any background in business, that never took an economics class, that never studied anything as it relates to business, economics, finance, etc., that would make better deals than Donald Trump. Donald Trump is so it's such a problem on his part, because part of it is an ego thing where he doesn't want to be seen as weak or whatever by compromising, but another part of it is just that he's just an incompetent guy who doesn't know how to do actual governing and doesn't really care to learn how it's done, because he'd rather watch Fox News with his cheeseburger or play golf in his golf simulator. I mean, there's so much about this that Ann Coulter finally woke up to, and she realized that, oh, actually, Trump talks the talk when it comes to a lot of the racial chauvinistic immigration policy, but he's too incompetent to walk the walk. Now, I'm glad that he's incompetent about it. I think it's a dumb idea to waste $70 billion reducing labor mobility. That's stupid. One, the U.S. economy basically depends on having somewhere between 13 and 20 million undocumented immigrants in the country at any one point, because, and there have been economic studies that have been done on this, where they will show industries such as agriculture or berry picking, somewhere along those lines, where farmers will offer American workers double the minimum wage to do these back-breaking manual labor type jobs. And the American citizens are like, nah, I'm not going to do it, dude. Like, that's great, that's a great wage, but I'm not going to do it. Or they sign up for it and they quit a day later. It's not the sort of thing that they're up for. Whereas a lot of the undocumented immigrants that come into the U.S., mostly from Mexico, but a lot of other Latin American countries, they actually stay like the full season, and they come back for other seasons. That they actually have a real work ethic. They have a profoundly intense work ethic. It's insane. It puts the average American work ethic to shame, to be honest. And I like America. I think America has a great ethos when it comes to a lot of economics and everything. And these guys, they put that whole thing to shame. I mean, there are a lot of studies that have been done, look at wealth, and they look at millionaires, they look at first generation millionaires, second generation millionaires. What they find is that it tends to be the case that actually immigrants to the U.S., especially their kids, do way better on average financially than the average native-born Americans. So if you're an American and you were born, say, in New York, and you make X money, well, the son of a Mexican immigrant is likely to make like 1.5, 2x what you're making. And that's ultimately good for everybody, because it means more tax revenue, it means more consumption in the economy. It ultimately makes the economy more vibrant. But I mean, you know, you can call me neoliberal scum or whatever, but in Ann Coulter's case, she's definitely opposed to all of that. She's basically the opposite of a neoliberal. She's a national socialist. She wants a racially chauvinistic economy that's centrally planned, that operates on a protectionistic socialist model, that keeps out any competition, and does make work projects to give her identity group a safe space, basically, you know? My uneducated white males and my heritages. That's her whole political platform. And that's not that far out of line with almost every socialist country that's ever existed, from North Korea to Cuba to Albania to the USSR to Hungary to Romania under Ceausescu. The list goes on and on. Vietnam, Cambodia, Communist China. It's just the Congo, the Republic of Congo. It just goes on and on. There's so many examples. And this is even to consider the Bolivarian socialist countries from Venezuela, Bolivia, etc., back, especially during the Cold War, where they had a profoundly racially centered political system, and at the same time coupled it with socialist economics. So they almost go hand in hand. The far left economics lends itself to far right racial politics. And so Ann Coulter's totally consistent with that. but she happens to look ridiculous because she's arguing for this in the United States. In other words, she's arguing for the model that some of the poorest countries that human history has ever seen relative to the era. She's arguing for that in America. If you were arguing for this in the Soviet Union in the 1940s, you would be just another loyal member of the Communist Party following Stalin's party line. But to be in America, one of the richest countries in history, where it's been proven without a shadow of a doubt empirically that the U.S. model of liberal capitalism and neoliberalism has just created more wealth and prosperity than any other system before, for the average person in particular, than any other system in history. To then go and say that you want the North Korean type economic and social model and you want the wall and everything, it's very anachronistic. It's out of place. It's uncanny. It's weird. It's the sort of thing that you would expect to see from a Kim Jong-un speech or a Kim Il-sung speech or a Mao Zedong speech or an Enver Hoxha speech. But then you hear it coming from Ann Coulter, who's supposedly this darling of the Charlie Kirk type conservative capitalists. I'm like, there is nothing capitalist about that, and she admits it. So yeah, this has been kind of a ramble about this, but I just found that this was a really worthwhile topic to highlight the grotesque hypocrisy of a lot of these people that are on the far right, where they use the idea of free enterprise or the idea of free speech as cute talking points so that they can shut down their opponents and get their National Socialist agenda through. And some people would outright just say, well, yeah, Ann Coulter, she's an American Nazi or whatever. I don't mean the Nazi in the sense that, does she have a swastika in her bedroom or whatever. No, I mean, she's literally a National Socialist. I'm not saying that she's a card-carrying member of the NSDAP from the 1940s or the 1930s. I don't mean that she's literally a Nazi in that sense. I don't even think that she thinks that Hitler was necessarily the best leader or whatever. But I mean in the technical sense that, well, yeah, she believes in nationalism, she believes in socialism, she believes in the confluence of the two with a racially chauvinistic immigration system. I guess she wouldn't be for doing a genocide against Jewish Americans. So that's, I guess, in fairness to her, she's not entirely like Hitler. But on the technical aspects of it, it's pretty darn close. And so I think it's a joke. I think anybody who takes Ann Coulter seriously, I think anybody who sees that whole movement and sees their arguments about free enterprise and free speech, but then goes and ignores the other arguments that betray themselves, such as either the defense of people like Bashar Assad or they want to give helicopter rides and kill the people who have left-wing ideas, so they don't actually believe in freedom of speech, or they don't actually believe in the idea of liberty or the American project because they actually want to have a state religion. There are so many areas where you can tell from these people that they don't actually believe in the idea of America. They don't believe in the American system. In Ann Coulter's case, is way closer to the North Korean system. It's almost, in fact, I would argue, apart from the idea of the Koreans as the cleanest race, if you just replace Koreans with whites, well, yeah, she believes in Judaism. She believes in the National Socialist autarky, basically. That's it. And so, no, she's the clown of the earth. And I'm glad that she reveals herself once again to actually be a clown of the earth, so that we don't actually need to have too much of a debate about it. It's almost an empirical fact at this point. So if you look up definition for clown, she'll be high up in that order after Donnie Yester, Vladimir Trump, and Crooked Roger Stone, and all these other people. The recent guy, Poon apologist Julian Assange, for example, total clowns. So thanks for watching, YouTube.